of all, there's a few goodies on the table back there. Unfortunately, the pins or the buttons and the stickers will ask a donation of like 50 cents each, and we'll maybe just collect the money at the end. And there maybe aren't enough, but there are some info sheets about the alternative spring break program with No More Deaths, where college students from around the country and around the world, actually, we had a German group last year, come out and do hands-on humanitarian aid with us and an educational trip during their spring break. As well as there's some other just informational stuff and a little altar to folks who have died. So how many people have saw the film 800 Mile Wall? Will someone share maybe something that has stuck with them since seeing the film? An image, a feeling you had, something someone said, something that was surprising.
There's in the beginning of the film when they found, I think his name was, I don't remember his name. He was sitting on the side of the road, and they wanted him to call immigration. And while he was telling his story, just the kind of look on his face as he was telling the story, like I've kind of never really seen that look in someone's face before. And so it's something that stuck with me.
Anyone else? Well, hopefully this will spark more questions at the end as well. And we, because of the amount of time, we'll go very kind of a brief overview of a lot of different issues, a lot of the work that No More Deaths does, and some of our experiences. And definitely hope that you will, if something is really interesting, just ask us at the end. So first about my own journey and how I came to be a desert wanderer myself. I went to a nearby APU, and for a semester abroad, I actually lived in Brussels, and worked for an organization that was lobbying the European Parliament for immigrant and refugee rights and better immigrant and refugee laws within the EU. So I was learning all about what the refugee issues were like for people trying to get refuge in the EU or people who have immigrated to the EU. And realized after coming home and finishing up school that I grew up in Arizona. I grew up crossing here the largest border in the world between a rich and a poor country, the largest land border, and had crossed that border hundreds of times as a kid, going to Mexico to go to the beach with my family and stuff like that, and realized that I knew very little about what was really going on in my own backyard. And so when I graduated, I thought that I was going to get a real job. I definitely have a lot of student loans, and I understand that reality. But felt very called just to go and see what was going on the border. And so I found myself finding out just about the different sister humanitarian organizations. Hi, welcome. I don't know. There are a couple seats up front.
There are a couple more here.
There's one here too. Maybe if you all get tired of standing, we can switch people out, or there'll be a break in about 15 minutes when Emrys starts talking. So I found myself moving back to Arizona and started volunteering what I thought would be just a few weeks with No More Deaths in their desert camp. And that summer, a few of our volunteers that I was working with were arrested and ended up being charged. They were, about my age. We were all doing the same work. They were medically evacuating 3 people who were in such bad shape that our doctors and lawyers on call said, you have to get them straight to an ER. And on the way, they were intercepted by Border Patrol, who arrested the men, held them, and deported 2 of them without medical attention. And our volunteers then were charged with conspiracy against the U.S. government and smuggling, pretty much. So they were facing about 15 years in prison. So of course I couldn't leave at that point to go get that real job. I was sucked into the beauty of the desert, of the Sonora Desert, where you have extreme beauty and extreme suffering at the same time. And Emrys will talk a lot more about the desert work of No More Deaths and what that really looks like. But that's really what pulled me in. And so I worked doing a lot of religious organizing that first year, trying to get our friends off the hook, trying to get the trial or the charges dropped, which eventually they were dropped. And I'm going to not even talk that much more about that campaign because there's so much more to talk about. But that was kind of what pulled me in. And then I was kind of commissioned by the group to start an aid station on the Mexico side of the border, and I'll show a map in a second. Right in Nogales, Sonora, Mexico, right on the other side of the border, where people are dumped off by the Homeland Security buses, which are now privately contracted buses. And they're literally dumped off at the line when they're picked up, whether in the desert or across the United States with raids or whatever. And they oftentimes don't have any money, and we were going to set up an aid station. So here I was, 22 years old, spoke a little bit of Spanish, not as much as I should have after so many years of Spanish. I don't know if anyone else understands that. So I quickly had to pick up a lot of street slang, and was living in Mexico. Found myself living there, forging binational partnerships with the Mexican state government as well as the Mexican Red Cross, a lot of other shelters and churches and different groups. Hi, welcome. And we literally just set up shop in a dirt parking lot and knew that people were getting dumped off and knew that there would be some kind of need, but we didn't know what that would look like. And so we were offering water and first aid. I became an EMT and in between all of that because I knew I wanted to be a better humanitarian and be able to do first response. So we do a lot of washing of feet, a lot of bandaging blisters. And if you saw the film, I think they'd probably show some of the feet pictures. And these aren't blisters that you get when you're wearing a new pair of shoes. These are blisters that can be really deadly, both because of infection and because they're like a third-degree burn, as well as they're so painful that if you're out in the middle of nowhere and you can't walk, then that's a death sentence. A lot of sprained ankles. So these people are flooding across the border from being dropped off by Border Patrol, and up to 1,000 or 1,200 people a day, a huge amount of people. And we started just listening to people's stories, giving the basic aid that we could, and little by little we realized that with every busload dropped off of people, we were hearing these stories of abuse and of mistreatment by Border Patrol in the short-term detention, short-term custody. And that's what I talk about in the 800-mile wall. We had just gotten back from Washington, D.C., where we were hosted by our Arizona representative to have a congressional briefing about Border Patrol abuse in short-term custody. And we published this report, Crossing the Line. That was in 2008. And just to read you some of the areas of abuse are verbal and physical abuse, as well as belongings not being returned, which is a really big deal when you only have a few belongings, and maybe your ID or a wedding ring are those belongings, or a little bit of cash that you might have to survive when you're back in Mexico. As well as dumping off vulnerable populations at night, like people who are really sick, or children, minors. There's also a lot, it's very typical that people aren't given sufficient food or water or medical treatment while in custody. So all these kinds of things we were hearing, and we realized that it's not just happening at a certain center or with a certain set of agents. This is happening very systematically over and over again, and we didn't go to Nogales to be per se to be human rights observers. We went there to be humanitarians and to try to save lives, but ended up also realizing that this was human rights work. And the reason why we felt like it would save lives by working in Nogales, and we also have partnered to work in other stations along the border on the Mexico side, was that we knew people were trying to cross multiple times.